Hi, I'm Jamie. This is Dead Dodge Garage, and this is Dylan's Dart Sport, currently a hovercraft. In the last video on this car, we overhauled the entire front suspension and completed a disc brake swap. That front suspension K-frame assembly is in the car right now. We had to do that to move it to this spot over here in the middle of the shop. I installed this 2-post lift specifically to do Chrysler factory-style body drops. That means you put the entire drivetrain and K-frame suspension assembly together and then drop the car on top of it. The K-frame's still in right now, but as you can see, some other things are happening with the car. In case you missed the memo or you're new to seeing this project, what we're doing here is taking a factory Slant 6 automatic 74 Dart Sport and putting some more pep in its step with a 408 stroker, a TKX 5-speed, and a bunch of other very nice performance pieces. This build is very different than the cars I'm usually involved with. Normally, I like to keep things a little bit more stock, or stock plus. In the drivetrain department at least, this combination is very similar to Dale's Demon. A 360 based engine, a manual transmission. And of course it's wrapped in a very similar car as well. Unlike Dale's Demon, this car is going to end up with a lot of nice handling and braking parts as well. This is going to be an excellent road car. The other important part of this build is just replacing things that have aged, like the fuel tank, for example. It certainly didn't smell good inside, and of course you could just buy these things brand new, so we did that. As you can see, the new fuel tank is hanging in it. It's not plumbed yet, and we actually don't have a sending unit, or a lock ring, or a filler neck grommet. Anyway, more on that later. You may notice next to the gas tank there's a very important component missing, and that would be the entire rear end. For what we're doing here, the factory 7 1/4 differential is just not up to the job. I'm actually a strong believer in the 7 1/4 as an axle for a normal street car that's driven sanely. Even with a V8, if you don't try to get traction with these things, they can survive a very long time. I've done the research on that. We used to have a 73 Dart with a healthy 360 under the hood, but because it had small tires and an open 7 1/4 differential, it would just smoke the one tire forever. It lived that way for years. Once you put an engine like that in the front, and a tire like that in the back, well, the 7 1/4 is no longer going to do the job. That thing would break with a quickness. The natural choice for a performance Chrysler of this era, the 8 3/4 axle. Here's one for the garbage can CUDA. This is a dropout center section type axle, very much like a 9-inch Ford. These were used in all performance Chryslers, with the exception of some Hemi and 4-speed RTs and such, from like the mid-60s until the early 70s. And they're pretty stout pieces. Interesting note, every single car in this shop right now, except for the Dart Sport, has an 8 3/4. There are only two problems with the 8 3/4. One of them is specific to the A-body, and that is cost. These things have always been a little harder to come by than, say, a B-body housing, and if you want one today, you're liable to pay like around $1,000. If you're a talented fabricator, or if you know one, you can take a much cheaper B or C body 8 3/4 axle and then have the perches moved and the tubes shortened to the A-body length. Or, if you're really clever, to even narrower than the A-body length to help fit gigantic tires. I am not a brilliant fabricator. I do know a couple. In fact, I know a guy that specializes in shortening these things, but he's hours away from here and, well, I just can't be bothered. So these housings I was going to take him are still out here rusting. Of course, after you secure a housing, there's also the additional cost of a center chunk. If you want a sure grip, these can cost $500, $800, $1,500 if you want an all new one. So you have to figure that in as well. If you go the shortening route, you're going to have to find axle shafts as well. In fact, stronger aftermarket axles, very good idea, which I can tell you from experience. They're not supposed to be two-piece. There are companies out there that build axles. As I understand, ready-made A-body axles, especially with the smaller bolt pattern, which I personally prefer, are a little harder to come by these days, so your mileage may vary on that. It's certainly another expense, especially if you're shortening an axle and you don't just have these. That second problem with the 8 3/4, shock loading. Essentially what that means is dumping the clutch in your high-torque manual transmission car, you can break them. The 9-inch Ford axle is pretty much the gold standard in drag racing, in performance street machines, in custom hot rod building, in classic cars in general, and there are several good reasons for that. Of course, it's a similar design to the 8 3/4, so it's a fair comparison to make. Despite being similar in dimensions, what's a 1/4 inch of ring gear diameter among friends, they are not actually the same. The Ford has a different pinion location, which is stronger. Although it takes a little bit more power to turn, it hangs together pretty well. And the reinforcements around the pinion in the 9-inch carrier, far, far superior to the 8 3/4. In general, this is a very robust differential, and it served Chrysler well for many years. But even they understood that in certain high torque applications, or for drag racing, the 8 3/4 was probably not up to the task. And that is why 440 and Hemi RTs and similar cars from the late 60s got a very special axle. This is a Dana 60. This particular Dana 60 is under the back of a 1979 Dodge W200 Power Wagon. And that makes sense because the Dana 60 has been widely used by many manufacturers for many decades as a truck axle. That's what it was designed to do. It doesn't exactly take a differential expert to realize how much beefier that Dana axle is than the 8 3/4 and, well, just about anything else you'd ever find in a muscle car or a classic. Of course, in a truck application, the Dana 60 is what's known as a full floating axle. The axle shaft here actually bolts into the separate hub mounted out here at the wheel end. That hub has inner and outer bearings. It's very strong. Also, it has 8 lug nuts, because it's a truck. The Dana 60 used in muscle era B and E bodies is a very interesting piece. It has that gigantic truck center section here, but the outers are essentially exactly the same as one of these 8 3/4 axles. It doesn't use that crazy floating hub, it uses Chrysler's semi-floating design. Now from the factory, the A-body was never equipped with the Dana 60. For one thing, it's a much smaller car. And while there were some big block equipped variants in the late 60s, and even a Hemi Dart, which is this other thing, most of these were powered by small blocks or slant sixes. Even the spicy small blocks, like the 340s for example, did not put out the kind of torque that was known to break the 8 3/4. Yes, in drag racing situations, with a torquey small block and a manual transmission, it's possible to break one of these things. I can't tell you how many different people told me that I need to put a Dana 60 in Dale's Demon here, which, for the record, I will never do. When it came time to spec the package for this Dart Sport, my first instinct, of course, was an 8 3/4. For the most part, this will be a street-driven car, although it will be hitting a drag strip this spring, if all goes to plan, but that's another story. However, after the calculation of trying to hunt down another A-body housing, or have one made, and then get conversion axles for the big bolt pattern, and then find a limited slip carrier, either a new one or a used one, and then rebuild that with the gears we want, and all the other odds and ends, all of that added up to a big pain and a considerable expense. After a lot of head scratching and scouring the internet for other options, Dylan came up with this. This axle comes to us via Dr. Diff. Now, Dr. Diff is a specialist in Mopar stuff. They have all kinds of axle pieces. They carry new limited slip carriers for 8 3/4. They carry disc brake conversion kits. This axle assembly was actually built by Strange. Strange is another well-known company that sells differential components and builds axles. This is their S60. Now, the S60 can be configured to just about any specs you want. Any width, any hanger configuration, any brake outer setup. This is a mostly stock car, so of course we've opted for mostly stock. This is a stock A-body width. The perches have been moved inward for a spring relocation kit, which we'll talk about in a minute, but otherwise it's essentially just a normal A-body piece. Out here on the end, instead of the normal Chrysler 5-bolt pattern, we've got a Ford setup, and that allows us to bolt on Ford Explorer rear disc brakes. If you watch many videos on this channel, you already know I am not the shiny brand new fabricated differential guy. I'm the guy that digs around in junkyards for old stuff. This is not what I would choose generally. However, it's really easy to make a case for this thing. This axle was built to our exact specifications. We chose 373 gears. We chose a streetable limited slip. We chose to have it powder coated black. We got a factory type snubber to put on it, a plain black rear cover that won't stand out, the aforementioned width specs, leaf hangers, all of this. You can go on Dr. Diff's site right now and spec this exact axle. It's under $3,200. You may be thinking that sounds like a lot of money. And I agree. I mean, I've bought countless project cars for less than $3,000. Once you start adding up the cost of an A-body 8 3/4 housing and a limited slip carrier and axle shafts and everything else you'd need to put one of those in there, it's not far off. And don't forget all the time. And what you're getting for that price is a seriously stout piece of equipment. We will not be breaking this axle with 408 stroker torque and stick shift burnouts and big sticky tires. This thing is gonna hold up forever. Now I do wanna make a point here. I don't want anyone watching to get the idea that they need this for their low-powered street car. That is not the case. The garbage can Cuda here had a smaller Chrysler 8 1/4 for years, and it survived countless burnouts, a ridiculous amount of abuse from a handful of owners. Yeah, all the ring gear bolts backed out once, but other than that, it held up for a very, very long time. If you're building a low-power street car, consider one of those, or the 8 3/4 if you can find one. If you need the ultimate in strength, it's the Dana 60. I've said a lot of nice things about this setup, so now I'm gonna give you the not so nice part. This one shipped to me without retainers for the axles, which means I can't finish assembling it right now. Yay! Now I have only nice things to say about Cass with Dr. Diff. I sent him an email yesterday and he responded in like 10 minutes. I sent him pictures and he was flabbergasted by the fact that the axle retainers are just not here. Of course, we're dealing with two separate companies here. Strange actually built this thing, and apparently they missed the memo on including those. Because we were starting from scratch with rear brakes on this axle, Cass with Dr. Diff recommended we use these Ford brakes. It's really easy to just have the axle built with the correct end to accommodate for them. They have a parking brake built in, which goes inside of the top hat rotor. This came with cables to connect to the A-body. It's a good deal. But again, we're missing the axle retaining plate, which is really dumb. Thankfully, they are slotted, so the plate can be installed after the fact. The 4 nuts that will retain the brake assembly will also retain that plate and keep the axle from sliding out. So while we can't completely finish it, we're now working on the build out for this axle. You will notice that there are some shiny new leaf springs sitting under it. These are essentially a reproduction of the 340 spring. It's a 6-segment spring on both sides, not asymmetrical like a super stock. New U-bolts were included with the axle, which is great. The next important part of the equation, shock plates. These are special for larger axles compared to 7 1/4, so we can't reuse the originals. We didn't happen to order these with all the other stuff, so I grabbed these from the pile of Barracuda stuff. Hanging one of these giant U-bolts from the new axle over the 7 1/4 makes the difference there obvious. The U-bolt has to go through that shock plate to secure everything together, so you need the right plates. Keep that in mind if you're gonna upgrade your A-body axle. There's one more thing we're missing too. For some reason, when you get new leaf springs, they come with the large front bushing installed, but they do not come with the rear ones. So we've got those on order. They should be here this afternoon. Now I mentioned the leaf spring relocation kit. Here's a look at that. Essentially, it's a special forward hanger that moves the leaf spring as far inward as is possible. It uses this special bolt with a countersunk head to allow this to sit all the way against the frame rail. That gives you about an extra 1/2 inch of tire clearance. We may have been able to make all this work without it, but if you're building from scratch and you have the opportunity to do the relocation, you should probably just do that. I'll actually be doing a leaf spring relocation on the garbage can Cuda because my giant center lines that the slicks sit on do not currently fit. Part of the wheel well may be in the way as well, but that's another story. I've got all of this, a pile of additional parts, and a Jordan. We're gonna start bolting all this stuff together, at least to the point that we run out of components, and see if we can't get this axle under the Dart Sport today. Here's the shock plate installed with the U-bolts. Now what we're gonna do is snug those nuts down evenly from side to side, pull the leaf spring up to the axle housing and make sure they're snug. These do not get torqued until later when there's vehicle weight on this thing. With the leaf springs sorted, now we're working on this rear disc brake setup. Again, this is all Explorer stuff. We're using this because essentially we started from scratch on the rear end and this was cheap, readily available, and this thing will stop awesome. One annoying thing, they included flexible lines to go to the calipers and they included little brackets and screws, but they didn't include anywhere to screw those to. There weren't any instructions either, so I don't know what they had in mind. Here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna strip the powder coating in this convenient location and we're gonna weld that tab down. With that done, this flexible line will go right to there, and then we'll build a solid line to go across over the hump and to the splitter on this side. We did grab the original brake line holder off the 7 1/4, so I guess we are reusing something. This side's a little goofy. These flexible lines are long enough to reach all the way over to here, so we're gonna have the world's shortest solid line going from the splitter to that. Yeah, that'll work. And there's number 2. That actually looks nice. Check it out. brake lines appeared as if by magic. This is that nice nickel something alloy. It bends really easily by hand, so you don't even need any special tools, and it's easy to flare. Of course, as with all flare fittings, do make sure you install the nut before you flare it. Here's one of the offset spring shackles assembled. As you can see, just like the front mount, it kicks the leaf in like half an inch or so to make extra room for the tires. This setup's a little different than the standard shackle. Those have the studs attached to one of these plates and then just nuts over here on a second stud. This is actually two separate plates and two long studs with nuts on both sides. With all of that done, we're ready to heave this thing up onto the transmission jack and raise it up into the car. We do have the brake calipers, rotors, and axle shafts off, which should lighten it a little, but probably not much. This is still a big, heavy assembly. So I'm sure this will be great fun. Yeah, did you know Dana 60s are heavy? Anyway, we got it up on the jack, strapped it in place, almost dropped it on our nuts twice, and then we got it forward, jacked up into position. We started the forward hangers first. We actually had to loosen up the U-bolts a little bit so we could flex the springs. It's a tight fit, but we did manage to get them started on my side. Then Jordan got them started on his side. We did have to gently beat these with a dead blow hammer, and now we've got all the hardware started on the front. Next, we'll pull the strap off, lower the jack, and flip the rear hangers into position. Note, there are two through bolt holes for the front leaf spring hanger. We used the bottom one, which matched the factory bracket on the 7 1/4. If you wanted to lower this and angle the diff slightly, you could go for that upper hole. Here's another fastener that does not get torqued until there's vehicle weight on this thing. This will be a little bit challenging because we can't get to the bolt here, but as tight of a fit as it was, I don't think it'll be a problem. We should be able to reef this tight. The bolts that go through the bushings on the leaf springs are left loose-ish, you know, snug, until there's weight on the suspension. But these brackets can be torqued at any time. Shiny new Bilstein shocks to match the front, installed. E-brake cables are locked in. Of course, they didn't give us new clips for this. The factory ones are supposed to fit, but they don't. I went to my hardware assortment and found some E-clips of a suitable size, and now we're good. We are not gonna hook this up to the forward cable section until the transmission and engine are in place. On the original setup, the cable kind of ran under the tail housing, and I'm sure with the new larger transmission, that's gonna be a problem. We may even have to come up with some special bracketry to space it downward. Well, would you look at that? It's a completed-ish Dana 60 in an A-body Mopar. It looks like it means business. I'd be very excited to get the wheels on this thing and put it on the ground, kind of get an idea how it sits and take it all in. Unfortunately, we still don't have those retainer plates, so we're just kind of screwed for now. Of course, there's a whole lot more to do on this car, like, for example, dropping this K-frame assembly back out to put the shiny new engine on it. The seat and the carpet have to come out so we can weld stuff onto the floor and so we can cut a hole for a shifter. And then, of course, we've got all this to install. And all this. But all that'll have to wait for future episodes. So, until then, as ever, thanks for watching. And remember, sometimes things that are expensive are worse.